The courtroom was silent. The air was heavy. Everyone stared at the judge, waiting for his response. The teenage boy, no older than 16, stood in front of him, his hands clenched into fists. His face was tough, but his eyes showed fear. The boy had been caught smoking in a place where smoking was strictly forbidden. The punishment was supposed to be simple: community service, a fine, maybe even a short stay in juvenile detention. But the judge wasn't saying anything. He just looked at the boy, long and hard. His eyes glistened, as if he was holding back something powerful. The room was filled with lawyers, police officers, and reporters, but none of them made a sound. Then, the judge took a deep breath. "I once knew a boy like you," he said, his voice shaking. "He was just as reckless, just as stubborn. He thought he was invincible. But let me tell you what happened to him." The courtroom leaned in. The boy's tough exterior wavered. His fingers twitched. The judge's next words would change everything. 2 weeks earlier, the streets of Brooksville were quiet that night. The air was cold, and the streetlights flickered. Jake leaned against the alley wall, the cigarette between his fingers glowing in the dark. He took a long drag, then exhaled, watching the smoke swirl in the air. His best friend, Mikey, stood next to him, kicking at the gravel with his sneaker. "Dude, you sure this is a good idea?" Mikey asked, glancing around nervously. Jake scoffed. "Relax. Nobody comes here this late." Mikey didn't look convinced. "Yeah, but this is right outside the courthouse. If we get caught..." Jake rolled his eyes. "Mikey, man, you worry too much." But before Mikey could argue, a deep voice cut through the alley. "You boys enjoying yourselves?" Jake froze. He turned his head slowly. A police officer stood at the end of the alley, his arms crossed. His badge gleamed under the streetlight. Mikey dropped his cigarette and stomped it out. We were just..." "Save it," the officer snapped. "Both of you, hands where I can see them." Jake's heart pounded. He had been caught before, but this was different. This wasn't just any officer. This was Officer Grant, the hardest, strictest cop in town. "You do realize you're smoking right outside a courthouse?" Officer Grant asked, stepping closer. "A government building. A prohibited area." Jake swallowed hard. He wanted to run, but he knew better. Mikey spoke first. "Sir, it won't happen again. We swear." Officer Grant shook his head. "It's not that easy." He reached for his radio. "You boys are coming with me." Mikey groaned. "Come on, man. It's just a cigarette." The officer's face darkened. "Tell that to the judge." Jake sat in the police station, his knee bouncing up and down. Mikey sat next to him, biting his fingernails. Their parents had been called, but Jake didn't care. He had been through this routine before. A lecture, a warning, maybe a slap on the wrist. But when the officer returned, his face was serious. "You're not getting off easy this time," he said. "Tomorrow morning, you'll be in front of Judge Carter." Jake felt his stomach twist. Judge Carter was known for being tough on teens like him. If there was anyone who wouldn't let him slide, it was him. Jake leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Well," he muttered, "guess I'm in trouble." Mikey groaned. "Dude, we're dead." Jake smirked, trying to act cool. "Nah, it's just another day in the life." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Jake stood beside his lawyer, trying to look bored, but his hands were sweating. His mom sat in the back, her arms crossed, her face tight with disappointment. Mikey's parents sat next to her, whispering anxiously. The bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter." The room stood up. The heavy doors opened, and Judge Carter walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a face that looked like it had seen too much of the world. He adjusted his glasses and took his seat. He looked at Jake. Jake looked back, defiant. The judge picked up a file and flipped through it. His expression was unreadable. "Jake Reynolds," he said finally, 16 years old. "Arrested for smoking in a prohibited area. This isn't your first time in court, is it?" Jake shrugged. "Guess not." Murmurs ran through the courtroom. His mother covered her face. The judge stared at Jake for a long moment. Then, he closed the file. "You think this is funny?" he asked. Jake hesitated. "No. You don't sound sure." Jake shifted his weight. "It's just a cigarette." The judge's expression didn't change. He leaned forward. "Let me tell you a story, Jake." The room fell silent. Jake frowned. "A story?" Judge Carter nodded. "A story about a boy. A boy just like you. A boy who thought breaking the rules didn't matter. A boy who thought he had all the time in the world." Jake rolled his eyes. "Look, Judge, if this is another. His name was Daniel. Jake stopped. The judge's voice was firm but quiet. He was 16, just like you. He smoked his first cigarette behind his school, just like you. At first, it was just for fun, just to feel tough, just to prove something. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. But one cigarette became 10. 10 became a habit. The habit became an addiction. He kept saying he could quit whenever he wanted. Until one day, the judge's voice faltered. His hands tightened into fists. Jake swallowed. What happened? Judge Carter looked at him. His eyes were wet. One day, Daniel didn't get to quit. A cold feeling ran through Jake's chest. He didn't understand why, but his heart started beating faster. The judge's voice broke. Because he died. Gasps filled the courtroom. Jake's mouth went dry. His mother let out a small, sharp breath. Even Mikey's parents looked shaken. The judge took a deep breath and wiped his eyes. And do you know how I know that story so well? Jake's throat felt tight. How? The judge's voice was barely a whisper. Because Daniel was my son. The entire courtroom froze. Jake felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. His tough attitude crumbled. He stared at the judge, his mind spinning. This was not just another lecture. This was not just another warning. This was personal. And for the first time in his life, Jake was afraid. The judge took a deep breath. The entire room was watching him, waiting for what he would say next. Jake's heart pounded. His mouth was dry. He wanted to speak, but he couldn't. He couldn't think. Then, Judge Carter looked him in the eye, and what he said next shattered the entire courtroom. Judge Carter's eyes were locked onto Jake's, and in that moment, the teenager felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The weight of the judge's words pressed down on him like a mountain. My son, Daniel, was just like you. Judge Carter continued, his voice steady but full of pain. 16. Young. Reckless. He thought smoking was no big deal. Just one cigarette here, another there. Until one night. The judge took a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if to steady himself. Jake couldn't move. He barely breathed. Daniel was walking home from a party. He had just finished a cigarette when he started coughing. It was nothing at first, just a tickle in his throat. The judge clenched his jaw, but then he started gasping. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt like it was being crushed. He collapsed right there on the sidewalk. The courtroom was completely silent. The reporters had stopped writing. The attorneys had stopped whispering. Even the police officers watching from the back of the room stood frozen. The doctors said it was an asthma attack triggered by years of smoking. But no one knew he had asthma, because he never told anyone. He thought he was fine. The judge's voice trembled. By the time someone found him, it was too late. Jake swallowed hard. Judge Carter's eyes burned with unshed tears. I held my son's hand in that hospital bed, praying for him to wake up. But he never did. And you know what I remember most about that night? His hands clenched into fists. The smell of cigarette smoke on his clothes. A quiet sob came from the back of the room. Jake turned slightly and saw his mother, her face buried in her hands. Judge Carter's voice hardened. So, Jake, you say it's just a cigarette? You think this is just another slap on the wrist? He leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking onto Jake's. Let me tell you something, son. The next cigarette you smoke could be the one that kills you. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The judge exhaled slowly. And I will not, under any circumstances, let another boy die when I have the power to stop it. Silence. The entire courtroom felt frozen in time. Jake had no words. His throat felt tight, and his hands were shaking. He wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Judge Carter took a deep breath and sat back in his chair. Now, let's talk about your punishment. Jake felt his heart drop. The night before the trial had been different. Jake hadn't been scared. He had been annoyed. Sitting in his bedroom, he tossed a baseball in the air, catching it lazily with one hand. His mother paced the floor, arms crossed, her face filled with frustration. Do you even care? She snapped. Jake sighed. Mom, it's not that big of a deal. Not a big deal, she repeated, eyes wide. Jake, you were caught smoking outside a courthouse. Do you understand how serious this is? Jake rolled his eyes. It's just a cigarette. His mother's face twisted in pain. Do you know what your father would say if he were here? Jake stiffened. His father, the man who had walked out on them when he was 6. The man who never called, never wrote, never cared. He's not here, Jake muttered. So who cares? His mother flinched, but her voice stayed firm. I care. And if you won't listen to me, then you'll have to listen to the judge tomorrow." Jake didn't reply, but now, standing in the courtroom, he realized how wrong he had been. This wasn't just another punishment. This was different, and he had a feeling his life was about to change forever. Judge Carter tapped his fingers on the desk. "Jake, you have two choices." Jake's palms were sweating. He had never been this nervous before. "1," the judge continued. "I can sentence you to 60 days in juvenile detention." Jake's stomach flipped. "Or 2," the judge's voice softened, just a little. "You can take a different path. A harder one. One that might actually change your life." Jake's heart pounded. What do you mean?" Judge Carter leaned forward. "I'm sentencing you to a 6-month rehabilitation program. You will spend your time volunteering at a hospital, specifically in the respiratory unit." Jake blinked. "What?" "You'll see firsthand what smoking does to people. You'll watch patients struggle to take their last breaths. You'll hear the sound of machines keeping them alive. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what I'm trying to teach you." Jake's mouth went dry. 6 months? At a hospital? Judge Carter's voice was calm but firm. "I'm not sending you there to punish you, Jake. I'm sending you there to save you." Jake couldn't look away. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than anger. He felt afraid, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. The courtroom was still buzzing when Jake stepped outside. His mother walked beside him, silent. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, his mind racing. Hospital. 6 months. Was this really happening? Mikey jogged up beside him. "Dude, that was intense." Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. His head was still spinning. Mikey gave a nervous chuckle. "Man, I thought he was going to send you straight to juvie. But a hospital? That's rough." Jake finally spoke. "I don't think I had a choice." Mikey nudged him. "Hey, at least you're not locked up, right?" Jake didn't reply, because deep down, he had a feeling that whatever was waiting for him at that hospital was going to change everything. And maybe, just maybe, it would be worse than juvie. 2 days later, Jake stood outside St. Vincent's Hospital. The building loomed over him, huge and cold. The automatic doors slid open, and the smell of disinfectant hit his nose. A nurse greeted him at the front desk. "You must be Jake." He nodded slowly. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the respiratory unit." Jake swallowed hard. And then, behind her, he heard it. A sound that sent a chill down his spine. A deep, rattling cough. He turned his head and saw a man, thin and pale, hooked up to a machine that was forcing air into his lungs. His chest rose and fell with effort, his eyes sunken and tired. Jake froze. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a punishment anymore. This was real, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and something else, something Jake couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the sharp, clean scent of medicine. It was something heavier, something that made his stomach twist. The nurse, a woman named Karen, led him down a long hallway. The walls were lined with hand sanitizer dispensers, signs about proper hand washing, and posters warning about the dangers of smoking. One of them showed a picture of a pair of blackened lungs. Jake swallowed hard and looked away. "All right, Jake," Karen said, stopping in front of a room. "This is where you'll be spending most of your time." She pushed open the door, and the first thing Jake heard was the beeping of a heart monitor. The room was dimly lit, and the air felt thick. He stepped inside hesitantly. Lying in the bed was an old man, frail and weak, his skin pale. A tube ran from his nose, attached to a machine that hissed and whirred with every breath he took. His eyes, sunken and tired, slowly opened to look at Jake. "This is Mr. Thompson," Karen said gently. "He's been here for 3 months." Jake shifted uncomfortably. Karen's voice softened. "He has chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. COPD." Jake frowned. He had no idea what that meant. Karen must have noticed his confusion because she sighed and folded her arms. "It means his lungs are failing him. It started with smoking. Decades of it. Now, he can barely breathe without that machine." Jake looked at the man again. He looked so small, so helpless. Mr. Thompson's lips moved slightly, and Jake realized he was trying to speak. He leaned in a little, and the man's voice, weak and raspy, came out. "Don't be like me." Jake felt his stomach twist. Karen gave Jake a small pat on the shoulder. "This is real, kid. These people didn't think it would happen to them either." Jake didn't know what to say. He had never seen someone this sick before. He had never even thought about what smoking could do beyond the usual, "it's bad for you" speeches from teachers and parents. But now it was right in front of him, and it was terrifying. His first few days at the hospital were quiet. He didn't have to do much, just deliver water to patients, help move equipment, and watch the nurses work. He tried to avoid the worst rooms, the ones where patients were barely conscious, where their chests rattled with every breath. But one night, he was asked to help in room 208. A woman, no older than 40, was sitting upright in bed, struggling to breathe. Her eyes were wide with panic, her hands gripping the sheets. A nurse stood beside her, adjusting her oxygen mask, speaking in a calm voice. "It's okay, Maria," the nurse said. "Just breathe in slow, okay?" Jake stood frozen in the doorway, watching as the woman gasped for air, her entire body shaking with the effort. Maria suddenly turned her head and saw him. "You," she rasped, reaching out a trembling hand. Jake's chest tightened. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. "Don't do what I did," Maria whispered. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. "I started young, thought I had time." Her body shuddered. "I can't even hold my son," without gasping for air. Jake's hands clenched into fists. The nurse glanced at him. "Jake, could you bring me a cup of water from the hall?" He nodded quickly and rushed out, his heart pounding. When he returned with the water, Maria was still shaking, her breathing uneven. He placed the cup on the bedside table and hesitated. Then, without thinking, he whispered, "I'm sorry." Maria gave him a weak smile. "Just don't be like me." Jake swallowed the lump in his throat and left the room. For the first time in his life, he felt something deeper than guilt. He felt regret. Days turned into weeks. Jake saw things he would never forget. A teenage girl, only a few years older than him, struggling to breathe after years of vaping. A man in his 30s, coughing up blood, his wife crying beside him. An old woman gripping Jake's hand, whispering, "I wish I could go back." Everywhere he turned, he saw what smoking did to people, and it scared him. One afternoon, he sat alone in the break room, staring at the floor. His hands trembled slightly. He had been so stupid. "Hey." Jake looked up and saw Karen standing in the doorway. She had a knowing look on her face. "Tough day?" she asked. Jake nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Karen walked over and sat beside him. "It gets to you, huh?" Jake swallowed. "Yeah." She sighed. "That's the thing about working in a hospital. You see what people ignore." She paused. "You start realizing how many mistakes could have been avoided." Jake exhaled slowly. "I didn't think it was a big deal." Karen nodded. "Most people don't. Until it's too late." Jake stared at his hands. "I keep thinking, what if that's me one day?" Karen gave him a sad smile. "That's up to you, Jake." That night, Jake lay awake in bed. His mind kept going back to the courtroom, to Judge Carter, to the story about his son, Daniel. He had been just like Jake. Young, careless. And now he was gone. Jake rolled onto his side, staring at the ceiling. He had always thought he was in control of his life, that nothing could touch him. But now he wasn't so sure. And the thought of ending up like the patients he had seen terrified him. The next morning, Jake walked into the hospital feeling different. He didn't just see patients anymore. He saw people. People who had dreams, families, lives they had lost piece by piece because of a choice they thought was harmless. And then, as he walked past a hospital room, he heard it. A voice. Weak. Familiar. He stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering. No way. He turned and looked into the room. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Sitting in the hospital bed, hooked up to an oxygen machine, was someone he never expected to see here. Mikey, his best friend. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Mikey looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Jake, he rasped. Jake took a step forward, his hands shaking. What happened?" Mikey tried to speak, but a violent cough racked his body. He gripped the edges of the bed, his chest heaving. A nurse rushed in, adjusting the machine, whispering something soothing to him. Jake felt his stomach drop. This wasn't supposed to happen. Mikey wasn't supposed to be here. But he was. And in that moment, Jake realized this wasn't just about him anymore. This was real. This was happening. And Mikey might not make it out alive. Jake's legs felt weak. His hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe, staring at his best friend lying in that hospital bed. Mikey, the guy who had always been full of life, who cracked jokes even when they got in trouble, who made everything feel like just another adventure, now looked like a ghost of himself. His skin was pale, his lips dry, and every breath he took sounded like a struggle. His chest rose and fell with a wheezing, rattling sound that made Jake's stomach twist. Jake swallowed hard. Mikey, what happened? Mikey tried to smile, but it barely reached his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but then his body convulsed as another violent cough ripped through him. His whole frame shook, his fingers gripping the sheets so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jake took a step forward, panic rising in his chest. Mikey, the nurse beside him placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. He needs rest. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were serious. You can stay, but don't stress him out. Jake nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Mikey blinked up at him, trying to focus. After a long pause, he rasped, Guess. I should have listened to you. Jake's chest clenched. What are you talking about? Mikey gave a weak chuckle, then winced. It's my lungs, man. His voice was barely above a whisper. Doctor says, I've got early signs of emphysema. Jake froze. His ears rang. Emphysema. He had heard that word before, just days ago, from Karen. It was a disease that destroyed your lungs, made it harder and harder to breathe until one day. You just couldn't anymore. Jake felt sick. No way, Mikey. You're 16. You. Mikey nodded slowly. Doctor said some people get it early. And me? He tried to laugh again, but it turned into another cough. I guess I'm just lucky. Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. Mikey had been fine just a week ago. They had been messing around, laughing, sneaking smokes behind the school. It was supposed to be harmless. But now Mikey was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that were keeping him breathing. Jake felt like he was going to throw up. How bad is it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mikey didn't answer right away. He looked away, his jaw tight. Then, finally, he muttered, Doc says if I quit now, I might have a chance. He exhaled shakily. But if I don't, I could be on one of these machines for the rest of my life. Jake felt his heart stop. The rest of his life? He swallowed the lump in his throat. Then you have to quit, Mikey. Mikey let out a weak, tired breath. Yeah, but he didn't sound convinced. And that scared Jake more than anything. Jake sat beside Mikey's hospital bed for hours. Neither of them spoke much. The beeping of the machines filled the silence between them. Jake kept replaying everything in his mind. Every time they had smoked together. Every time they had laughed about it, acted like it was no big deal. Now it wasn't funny anymore. Now it was real. At some point, Mikey fell asleep, his breathing still rough and uneven. Jake stared at him, guilt clawing at his chest. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here and watch his best friend waste away. The next morning, Jake marched into Karen's office. I need to help him, he said, his voice firm. Karen looked up from her desk, raising an eyebrow. Mikey. Jake nodded. He's not going to stop on his own. He doesn't believe he can. His fists clenched. But I can't let him go down like this. Karen studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in her chair. Helping someone quit isn't easy, she said. Especially someone who doesn't think they need to. Jake exhaled. I don't care. I have to try. Karen tapped her fingers on the desk, thinking. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a small booklet. This is a nicotine withdrawal guide, she said, handing it to Jake. It'll tell you what to expect. The cravings, the mood swings, the symptoms. She paused. And the risks. Jake took the booklet, flipping through the pages. Karen continued. Mikey's body is already addicted. If he tries to quit cold turkey, it'll be tough. He'll feel sick. His lungs will hurt even more before they start to heal. Jake swallowed. How long does it take? Karen sighed. Depends on the person. Could be weeks. Could be months. Could be years. Jake's stomach twisted. And if he doesn't quit? Karen's face darkened. Then he's got a much shorter future ahead of him. Jake clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let that happen. That night, Jake sat by Mikey's bed again. Mikey was awake, staring at the ceiling, his breathing slow and tired. Jake held up the booklet. We're doing this. Mikey turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. Doing what? Jake opened the booklet to the first page. You're quitting. Mikey sighed. Jake. No, Jake cut him off. I don't want to hear it. I don't care if it's hard. I don't care if it sucks. I am not sitting here watching you kill yourself. Mikey blinked, caught off guard. It's not that simple, man. Yes, it is, Jake snapped. You either quit or you don't. And if you don't, he swallowed hard. Then you end up like every single person I've seen in this hospital. Mikey looked away. I don't know if I can. Jake leaned forward. Then I'll help you. Mikey was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he muttered, "What if I fail?" Jake's voice softened. "Then we start over. As many times as it takes." Mikey sighed, rubbing his face. Then, finally, he nodded. Jake exhaled in relief. "Okay. First thing tomorrow, we start." Mikey chuckled weakly. "You sound like a drill sergeant." Jake smirked. "Damn right." But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be easy. This was just the beginning, and things were about to get a whole lot harder. The next morning, Jake woke up to a loud, desperate sound. He sat up in his chair, eyes wide. Mikey was gripping his chest, his face twisted in pain. His whole body was shaking, and sweat dripped down his forehead. Jake's stomach dropped. Mikey gasped, "Jake, something's wrong." Then, suddenly, the heart monitor flatlined. Jake's world stopped. Nurses rushed in, pushing him aside, shouting orders. Jake stood frozen as they worked on his best friend. "Mikey," he shouted. But Mikey wasn't responding. Jake felt his heart hammer in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not yet. Not now. But as the doctors scrambled to save Mikey's life, Jake realized something. They might already be too late. "Mikey, wake up." Jake's voice cracked as he shouted, his chest tightening with fear. He was pushed back as a team of nurses and doctors rushed into the room. "Code Blue," one of them called out. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Jake stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched in horror as the nurses hooked up more machines, the doctor pressing his fingers against Mikey's neck, searching for a pulse. "Stay with us, kid," one of the nurses muttered under her breath. The heart monitor still showed a flat line. Jake felt his world crumbling. This couldn't be happening. Not Mikey. Not his best friend. He pressed his fists to his forehead, shaking his head furiously. "No, no, no, no." Charging to 200 joules, the doctor called. Jake's eyes widened as he saw the paddles of the defibrillator being prepared. Clear. Mikey's body jerked as the electric shock surged through him. Jake clenched his teeth, barely able to breathe. Nothing. No heartbeat. The doctor's face was tense. Charging again. 300 joules. Clear. Another shock. Jake felt like he was going to collapse. Then, a beep. The heart monitor flickered. Then another beep. Then another. "He's back," a nurse said quickly, adjusting the oxygen levels. Jake let out a shaky breath, his knees nearly buckling beneath him. Mikey's eyelids fluttered, his breath shallow. His fingers twitched slightly against the blanket. Jake rushed forward, gripping the edge of the bed. "Mikey," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Mikey's lips parted slightly. His voice was barely above a breath. "Did. I died." Jake let out a choked laugh, his hands gripping his best friend's. "Not today, idiot." Mikey's eyes, though weak, held something new. Fear. Real fear. For the first time since they had started smoking, since they had been sneaking cigarettes behind school, since they had been laughing about it, Mikey was afraid. And maybe, just maybe, he finally understood. Hours later, Mikey was stable, though he was still weak. Jake sat beside his bed, running a hand through his hair, exhausted. Mikey turned his head slightly. His voice was hoarse. "That was the worst wake-up call ever." Jake scoffed. "Yeah, well, you scared the hell out of me." Mikey tried to smirk, but it faded quickly. His fingers curled around the blanket. "I thought I was gone, man. I felt cold. Like everything was just fading." Jake swallowed hard. "Don't say that." Mikey sighed. "It's real, huh?" Jake looked at him. "What is?" Mikey's lips pressed together. "The stuff we joked about. The warnings. The you'll die if you keep smoking speeches." His voice wavered. "It's not just words." Jake exhaled. "No, it's not." Mikey's fingers tightened around the blanket. "I don't want to die, Jake." His voice cracked. "Not like this." Jake's chest ached. He had spent years pretending none of this mattered. That smoking was just something cool to do. That they were untouchable. But Mikey had flatlined today. His best friend had come inches from death. And that changed everything. 2 days later, Mikey was still in the hospital, but he was recovering. Jake stayed with him as much as he could. Every night, he lay awake in the uncomfortable hospital chair, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his head. The courtroom, the judge's story, the patients he had met, Mikey collapsing, Mikey nearly dying. He couldn't get it out of his mind. On the third day, Judge Carter came to visit. Jake wasn't expecting it. He looked up from his chair as the judge walked into the hospital room, his face unreadable. Mikey, still weak, tried to sit up, but the judge held up a hand. Stay still, son. Mikey blinked, clearly surprised to see him. Hey, Judge. Judge Carter walked over to the foot of the bed, hands clasped in front of him. He studied Mikey for a long moment before turning to Jake. Walk with me, he said. Jake hesitated, glancing at Mikey. Mikey waved a weak hand. Go, man. I'm not going anywhere. Jake nodded and followed the judge out into the hallway. The two of them walked in silence for a moment before the judge finally spoke. I heard what happened, he said quietly. Jake shoved his hands into his pockets, looking down. Yeah. Judge Carter exhaled. You know, when I sentenced you here, I wanted you to see the consequences. But I never wanted you to experience it this close. Jake didn't say anything. Judge Carter glanced at him. How are you holding up? Jake let out a humorless chuckle. Not great. The judge nodded. I wouldn't expect you to be. They stopped near a window, overlooking the city. Jake finally spoke. I get it now. The judge turned his head slightly. Get what? Jake clenched his jaw. Why you told me about your son? His fists tightened. Why you did all of this? He exhaled. Because if you didn't, I'd be the next Daniel. Judge Carter studied him for a long time, then nodded. Jake took a deep breath. Mikey wants to quit. He's scared, but I don't know if he can do it. He looked at the judge. How do I help him? Judge Carter's expression softened. You stand by him. Jake swallowed. You remind him every day why he's doing it, the judge continued. You don't let him give up when it gets hard. And you don't let him forget what almost happened. Jake nodded slowly. Then the judge put a firm hand on his shoulder. And you quit, too. Jake stiffened. The judge's eyes bore into his. You can't help him if you're still doing it. Jake felt something twist in his chest. He had thought about quitting. He had even told himself he would. But now, he realized it wasn't just a decision. It was a commitment. One that would decide the rest of his life. Jake exhaled. I'll do it, he said. The judge nodded approvingly. Good. Then, after a pause, he said something that Jake didn't expect. I'm proud of you, Jake. Jake's throat tightened. He wasn't sure why, but those words hit him harder than anything else. Maybe because he had never heard them from his own father. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, he actually felt like he was doing something right. Maybe because, in this moment, he wasn't just some screw-up kid standing in front of a judge. He was someone trying to change. And for the first time, he believed he could. Jake walked back into Mikey's hospital room. Mikey glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Serious talk? Jake nodded. Yeah. Mikey sighed. We really messed up, huh? Jake sat down next to him. Yeah, but we're fixing it. Mikey hesitated, then muttered. I don't know if I can do this, man. Jake leaned forward. You can. Mikey scoffed weakly. How do you know? Jake smirked. Because I'm doing it with you. Mikey's eyes widened slightly. Jake grinned. Together, man. All the way. And for the first time, Mikey actually smiled. They weren't going down that road anymore. Not today. Not ever. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of Jake's life. Quitting smoking wasn't like flipping a switch. It wasn't just waking up one day and deciding to be done with it. It was a war, a battle against cravings, against habits, against the voice in his head that kept whispering, just one more. One more won't hurt. But Jake knew better now. One more would hurt. And he wasn't going to let it win. Mikey was struggling, too. Maybe even more than Jake. Some days, he was moody and irritated. Other days, he barely had the energy to talk. The withdrawal hit him hard. Sweating. Shaking. Headaches that made him groan and bury his face in the pillow. Jake stayed by his side through all of it. The first time Mikey nearly gave in was 2 days after leaving the hospital. They were walking home from a checkup, Mikey moving slowly, still weak from everything he'd been through. They passed by a gas station, and there, right by the entrance, was a kid about their age, leaning against the wall, a cigarette between his fingers. The smell hit them instantly. Mikey stopped walking. His breathing changed. Jake saw it in his face, the way his jaw tightened, his fingers twitched. He was fighting the urge. Jake knew that feeling. He had felt it himself more times than he wanted to admit. Mikey took a small step toward the kid, his eyes locked onto the cigarette. Jake grabbed his arm. Mikey flinched and looked at him, his face full of something close to panic. I just want to ask him for one, Mikey muttered, almost like he was trying to convince himself. Just one, Jake. Jake didn't let go of his arm. That's how it starts, he said firmly. Mikey hesitated. His breathing was shaky. Jake tightened his grip. You told me you wanted to live. Remember? Mikey swallowed hard. He clenched his jaw, then exhaled shakily. Without another word, he turned away from the gas station. Jake didn't let go until they were at least 3 blocks away. Mikey didn't say anything, but after a while, he muttered, "That was close." Jake exhaled in relief. "Yeah." Mikey looked at him. "How do we stop wanting it?" Jake didn't have an answer, because he wanted it, too. The next few days were a test of patience. The cravings didn't just go away. They came in waves. Sometimes, Mikey was fine. Other times, he was irritable and short-tempered. He snapped at Jake over small things, then apologized 5 minutes later. Jake knew it wasn't his fault. He had seen enough patients in the hospital going through withdrawal to know this was normal. But that didn't make it easier. One night, Mikey sat on Jake's bedroom floor, holding his head in his hands. "This sucks, man," he groaned. Jake was sitting on the bed, flipping a stress ball between his fingers. "Yeah." Mikey looked up, his eyes tired. "How long till it gets easier?" Jake sighed. "Karen said a few weeks, maybe months. Depends on us." Mikey groaned louder. "Months?" Jake smirked. "You wanted to live, right?" Mikey shot him a glare. "I also want to not feel like my brain is on fire." Jake tossed the stress ball at him. Mikey caught it, squeezing it a few times. "This better be worth it," Mikey muttered. Jake leaned back on his bed. "It will be." Mikey didn't answer, but after a long moment, he nodded. They were in this together, and neither of them was backing down. A week later, Jake had his final meeting with Judge Carter. He sat in the judge's office, shifting in his chair. Judge Carter sat across from him, hands folded on his desk. "So," the judge said, eyeing him carefully, "how's the program been?" Jake exhaled. "Hard." Judge Carter smirked. "Good." Jake gave him a look. "Good." The judge nodded. "If it was easy, you wouldn't have learned anything." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Jake, are you still smoking?" Jake straightened his shoulders. "No." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Not even once." Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "Not once." Judge Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded in approval. "And what about your friend?" Jake sighed. "Mikey's trying. He almost slipped once, but I stopped him." The judge gave him a small smile. "You've changed, you know." Jake blinked. "What?" Judge Carter leaned back. "The kid that walked into my courtroom was reckless, defiant, thought he was invincible." Jake looked down. He remembered. Judge Carter's voice softened. "But the kid sitting in front of me right now? He's different. He's not just thinking about himself anymore." Jake swallowed. He had never thought about it that way. But maybe the judge was right. Judge Carter exhaled and pushed a document toward Jake. "This is your official release from the program. You've served your time." Jake hesitated before taking it. That was it. He was done. Judge Carter gave him a knowing look. "But the real test isn't in here, Jake. It's out there." Jake nodded slowly. The judge's next words hit him like a punch to the chest. "Don't let my son's story become yours." Jake met his eyes, and for the first time, he truly understood. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for the people who never got the chance to. That night, Jake sat outside on his porch, staring up at the stars. Mikey sat next to him, tossing a small rock between his hands. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Mikey let out a deep breath. "We really did it, huh?" Jake nodded. Mikey smirked slightly. "Kinda proud of us, man." Jake chuckled. "Same." Mikey leaned back against the steps. "You ever think about what would have happened if we never got caught?" Jake didn't answer right away. He thought about it. About where they could have ended up. About the people he had met in the hospital, the ones who didn't get another chance. Then he looked at Mikey. At his best friend, still alive. Still here. And he knew. "Yeah," Jake muttered. "I think about it all the time." Mikey exhaled. "We were idiots." Jake grinned. "Total idiots." Mikey smirked. "Never again." Jake held out his fist. Mikey bumped it. "Never again." And for the first time, Jake knew they meant it. Because this time, it wasn't just words. This time, it was real. The months that followed felt like a slow transformation. Both Jake and Mikey had been through so much together, and the road to recovery, though far from easy, was one they walked side by side. The cravings were still there, lurking in the background, but each day they fought them off a little bit more. Each morning was a new chance to prove they were stronger than their past mistakes. Jake had his ups and downs, moments of frustration when the urge to smoke would hit him out of nowhere. It was like the nicotine had planted its roots so deep in his system, he could almost taste the cigarette before he even lit it. But every time that feeling came, he reminded himself of Mikey, of what had happened, and of what was at stake. Mikey had days when he could barely get out of bed, his body still healing, his energy a fragile thing. But there were also moments of laughter, of joking around, of sitting in Jake's room for hours talking about everything and nothing at all. It was strange to think about how different their lives could have been if they hadn't gotten caught. If Mikey hadn't been rushed to the hospital. If Judge Carter hadn't told his story, making it all feel so real. But it was real now. And they were still here. And that was something to be grateful for. One Saturday afternoon, a few months after they'd both quit, Jake and Mikey found themselves sitting outside the park. The weather was cool, the sky painted with streaks of purple and orange as the sun began to set. They'd been going for runs every weekend to keep their lungs healthy, but today they just sat on the grass, watching the world go by. "I can't believe it's been this long," Mikey said, stretching his legs out in front of him. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, an edge that Jake had noticed more often lately. Jake nodded, tossing a small rock in his hand. "Yeah, seems like just yesterday we were sneaking around, doing the stupidest stuff." Mikey exhaled, his eyes squinting at the setting sun. "We didn't know any better." Jake didn't respond right away. He knew Mikey was right. They'd been young, reckless, and thought they were invincible. It had taken a near-death experience for Mikey to get it, and for Jake to see it, too. "So how do you feel now?" Jake asked after a long silence. Mikey looked at him, his lips twitching into a small smile. "Different." He stretched again, like he was trying to shake off the weight of everything. "I don't think I realized how much I was holding on to. I don't know, I thought I was okay. But I was just numb. I didn't care." Jake tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" Mikey's gaze grew distant, his voice softer. "I thought smoking was the only thing that made me feel good. When I was smoking, everything else didn't matter. But now, I don't need it to feel alive." Jake couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like I can breathe again." Mikey laughed quietly. "Yeah, man, you can breathe. And it feels so much better, huh?" Jake nodded. "It does." They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the cool breeze tousling their hair. It felt like the world was pausing, just for them. Maybe they were just two teenage guys on a park bench, but to them, this moment meant more than any other. When Jake looked over at Mikey again, he saw something different in his eyes. A clarity, a strength. "You know, I think I'm ready to start something new," Mikey said quietly, his voice full of determination. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mikey smiled. "I'm not going to just sit here and keep going through life without purpose. I want to give back. I want to make up for all the years I wasted." He met Jake's eyes, his voice growing more passionate. "I want to help people, like the ones we saw in the hospital. Like the ones who didn't make it." Jake's heart swelled with pride. Mikey had always been a fighter, but now he had a reason to fight beyond himself. "That's huge, Mikey," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think you're right. I want to do that too. I want to make a difference." Mikey nodded, a sense of purpose behind his gaze. "It's never too late to turn things around, right?" Jake smiled, thinking back to everything they had gone through. "No, it's never too late." The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mikey signed up for a volunteer program at a local clinic, helping people who were trying to quit smoking. It wasn't easy, but he knew the struggle. He understood what it felt like to want to give up. Jake, too, found his own way of giving back. He started a support group at school for teens who were struggling with addiction, smoking, or otherwise. At first, it felt weird, like he wasn't ready to be the one helping others. But soon, he realized it was helping him too. They were both on a new path now, one that wasn't easy, but it was one that felt right. One evening, after another group meeting, Jake met Mikey outside the clinic. Mikey looked more tired than usual, but there was a smile on his face. "How'd it go today?" Jake asked. Mikey shrugged, but there was pride in his eyes. "It's not easy, man. Some people want help, some don't. But it feels good, you know? To know I'm doing something for someone else." Jake nodded. "I get that. Helping people makes me feel like I'm making up for all the stuff I did before. Like maybe I can make the world a little better." Mikey clapped him on the back. "You are, Jake. You really are." Jake smiled, looking at his best friend. They had both come a long way. "Let's keep it up," Mikey said, his voice steady. "Let's make sure nobody else has to go through what we did." Jake's heart swelled. "Yeah, let's do it." They walked down the street together, side by side. And as they did, Jake felt a quiet sense of pride settle in his chest. It wasn't just about quitting anymore. It was about living. And in that moment, with the cool evening air around them, Jake realized that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. And that was enough. The days began to feel like a new kind of normal, a rhythm they were finally beginning to settle into. Mikey and Jake had both changed in ways they hadn't expected. The scars from their past weren't completely gone, but they were healing, fading into something stronger. Jake's support group at school had grown steadily, and it wasn't just about smoking anymore. More and more kids came to him with other struggles: eating disorders, anxiety, self-doubt. They didn't just want advice. They wanted someone who had been where they were, someone who could understand without judgment. And Jake understood. He had been that kid, too. Lost, rebellious, angry at the world for no reason he could really explain. But now, as he sat with these kids, listening to their stories and offering his own, he felt like he was making a difference. And Mikey? Mikey was out there making his own waves, helping the people who walked into that clinic looking for a way out. He had become a mentor of sorts, someone who wasn't just talking the talk, but walking the walk. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. One afternoon, Mikey and Jake sat in the park again, just like they had all those months ago. It was the same park, the same spot they had sat when they'd made the decision to quit smoking, but everything felt different now. The air didn't seem so heavy. The world didn't feel like it was closing in on them. Mikey stretched out on the grass, eyes closed, his hands behind his head. You ever think about how far we've come? Jake smiled and leaned back, watching the clouds drift by. I try not to. It feels too weird. Mikey chuckled. Yeah, I get that. He paused, then added, but seriously, man, look at us. I used to be the guy with a cigarette in my hand, thinking I had nothing to lose. And now, I'm actually helping people. I'm making a difference. Jake's heart swelled with pride. You've always had it in you, Mikey. You just had to find it. Mikey smiled, his eyes still closed. Maybe, but it feels good, you know? Helping people who are where we were. Watching them turn things around. It's like we're doing something important. Jake nodded. We are. And we're not done yet. The sound of a car pulling into the parking lot nearby broke their silence. Both boys looked over and saw a familiar figure step out of the car. It was Judge Carter. Mikey sat up quickly. Whoa, what's he doing here? Jake stood up and waved. Guess we'll find out. Judge Carter smiled when he saw them. He was dressed in casual clothes for once, a rare sight outside of the courtroom. Hey, boys, he called as he approached. Hope I'm not interrupting anything. Jake grinned. Nah, we were just talking. The judge gave them a knowing look. That's good. That's really good. He stopped in front of them, looking around at the park, then back at the boys. I came to check in. See how you two are doing. I hear you've been making quite an impact. Mikey shrugged, a modest grin on his face. We're trying. Judge Carter chuckled softly. That's the spirit. But listen, I wanted to tell you something important. Jake and Mikey exchanged a quick glance, both curious. Judge Carter's expression turned serious. The reason I told you my son's story wasn't just to scare you. I told you because I know that what you're doing now, what you've both chosen to do with your lives, matters. It matters more than you'll ever realize. Mikey raised an eyebrow. You think we're really making a difference? The judge nodded. I don't just think it. I know it. People don't realize it, but the hardest part of recovery is not the physical cravings. It's the mental struggle, the feeling that you'll never get out of the hole you dug for yourself. But you two? You're proof that it can be done. You've both turned your lives around in ways most people never will. Jake felt a swell of pride and a twinge of guilt. But we're not perfect. We're still working on it. The judge smiled softly. Perfection isn't the goal. Progress is. And you've made so much progress. He glanced down at his watch. But the real reason I'm here is because there's something I think you both need to know. Mikey and Jake looked at each other, exchanging puzzled glances. What's that? Jake asked. Judge Carter took a deep breath, then nodded. I've been talking to the board, and they've decided to offer you both something. An opportunity to take your efforts even further. We want you to help start a youth mentorship program. One that goes into schools, into communities, and helps teens facing addiction, like you were. Jake's mouth went dry. Wait, what? You want us to help others the way you helped yourselves? Judge Carter finished. I think you're both ready. Mikey stared at the judge for a long moment before turning to Jake. Dude, this is crazy. Jake's mind raced. He had never imagined something like this. Helping others was one thing, But this was on a whole new level. They were being given the chance to guide people, to make real change on a bigger scale than they'd ever thought possible. I don't know what to say, Jake said quietly. The judge placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. Just think about it. You've got time. But I want you to know that we believe in you. And I believe in you. Mikey was quiet for a moment, clearly processing everything. Then he finally looked at Jake and said, Well, what do you think? Should we do this? Jake exhaled, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He thought back to everything. Judge Carter's story, the hospital, Mikey's struggles, and his own. They had both come so far. They had seen how bad it could get. And now they had a chance to do something about it. To make sure others didn't fall into the same traps. Jake turned to Judge Carter, then back to Mikey. He smiled, a sense of purpose settling in his chest. We're in, Jake said firmly. Let's do it. Mikey grinned. Let's change the world, man. And as they walked away from the park, Jake knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had already come this far. Together, they were ready for whatever came next. Because now, they weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who needed help. And for the first time in a long time, Jake truly believed they could make a difference. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Jake and Mikey dove headfirst into their new roles, helping to build the youth mentorship program from the ground up. At first, it felt like a daunting task, but the more they worked together, the more they realized they had something powerful to offer. They had been through the struggle, lived through the pain and the darkness, and now, they were ready to show others that change was possible. The program quickly gained traction. They held meetings at schools, community centers, and even online, connecting with teenagers who were going through the same struggles they had faced. It wasn't just about quitting smoking anymore. It was about mental health, self-worth, addiction, and finding the strength to keep going even when it felt impossible. Jake was amazed at the stories that came through. Teenagers who felt like they didn't have a voice, who had been told their whole lives that they were too messed up to be fixed, were now coming to them for help. It was humbling, and it made Jake realize how much his own experiences had shaped him into someone who could truly understand. Mikey was the same. He had always been a natural with people, able to relate to others without coming across as preachy or judgmental. It was easy for him to open up about his own struggles, to let others know that it was okay to fail, as long as they didn't give up. He was a beacon of hope for many, and it was clear that his recovery had given him the strength to inspire others. But as much as they had accomplished, there were still moments of doubt. There were days when Jake woke up, the weight of the responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He wanted to help, but sometimes he didn't feel like he had all the answers. Sometimes he didn't even feel like he was fully healed himself. It was a constant battle, both for him and for Mikey. One evening, after a particularly tough meeting where a student had confessed to relapsing, Jake sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He had texted Mikey several times, but it had been hours with no response. He knew Mikey had been struggling with his own doubts lately, even though he never showed it. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mikey. We need to talk. Meet me at the park. Jake's stomach tightened. He hadn't heard from Mikey like this in weeks. He stood up quickly, grabbed his jacket, and headed out the door. The park was quiet when Jake arrived. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the swings and empty benches. Mikey was sitting on the same bench where they had sat so many months ago, back when everything was just beginning to change. His head was bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. Hey, Jake called softly as he approached. Mikey looked up, his eyes tired but filled with something Jake couldn't quite place. He motioned for Jake to sit beside him. You okay? Jake asked, sitting down beside him. Mikey shrugged. I don't know, man. Some days, it feels like I've got it all together. Like I'm making a difference. And then other days, he trailed off, his voice barely a whisper. Jake's heart sank. What happened? You've been off lately. Did something happen at the clinic? Mikey shook his head. It's not that. It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough. I thought when I quit, it would all make sense. I thought I'd have everything figured out. He paused, staring out into the night. But I don't. I still feel like I'm failing people. Jake felt a lump in his throat. He understood. He really did. Sometimes I feel the same way, Jake admitted quietly. Like, I don't know if I'm doing enough. Or if I'm even the right person to be doing this. He paused, thinking back to the start of it all. But Mikey, We've come so far. We've changed our lives. And we're helping others change theirs. That's huge. Mikey looked at him, his expression softening. I know, but some days, I just want to give up. Jake placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. You can't give up. You don't have to have all the answers. Just being here, just showing up, is enough. You don't have to be perfect to make a difference. Mikey nodded slowly, his eyes starting to well up. I don't want to let people down. I don't want to let you down. Jake's heart ached for his friend. You're not letting me down. You're not letting anyone down. We're both in this together, remember? Mikey gave a small, shaky smile. Yeah, together. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation hanging between them, but also lifting something inside them both. Mikey wasn't alone. Jake wasn't alone. They had each other. Finally, Mikey spoke again, his voice stronger now. Thanks, man. I needed to hear that. Jake smiled. Anytime. Over the next few days, things began to shift. Mikey seemed to find his footing again, the weight of his doubts lifting a little each day. And for Jake, the fear of not being enough slowly started to fade. He realized that helping others didn't mean having all the answers. It meant being there, listening, and showing up when it mattered. The mentorship program continued to grow, and the impact they were making was undeniable. Teenagers who had once felt like they had no future now had hope. The messages of gratitude and success stories poured in, and for every relapse, there were 2 more victories. It was hard, and it was messy, but it was worth it. One afternoon, Jake stood in front of his group at school, his heart pounding. This was his first time speaking solo, without Mikey by his side, and he was nervous. But as he looked around at the faces of the kids who had come to him for help, something inside him clicked. This was why he was doing this. This was why it mattered. Hey, everyone. Jake began, his voice steady. I know what it feels like to be stuck. To think that change isn't possible. But I'm here to tell you that it is. And it doesn't matter how many times you mess up, how many times you fall. It matters what you do after. Because you can keep fighting. And you will win. He paused, looking at the faces in front of him. Some were hopeful, some were uncertain, but all of them were listening. You don't have to do it alone, he continued. We're all in this together. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a hand shot up from the back of the room. Jake, do you ever get scared? Jake smiled softly. Every day, but I don't let it stop me. And neither should you. The group nodded, some smiling, others silently processing. But Jake knew, deep down, that they were ready to take the next step. They had the support they needed, the guidance from people who understood. And together, they would keep fighting. Just like Jake and Mikey had. The next chapter in their lives wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about progress. And it was about never giving up on the fight, no matter how hard it got. And Jake knew, with certainty, that they were ready for whatever came next. As the months passed, Jake and Mikey found themselves constantly challenged. The mentorship program was growing, and they were often juggling meetings, schoolwork, and their own personal struggles. There were days when it felt like they were stretched thin, but neither of them was willing to back down. They had come too far, and they knew they were making a difference. One afternoon, as they sat in a local coffee shop, Mikey stared out the window, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. Something on your mind? Jake asked, leaning forward, his eyes studying his best friend. Mikey let out a long breath. I don't know, man. I feel like we're doing great things with this program, but I don't know if I'm doing enough for myself. You know, Jake raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mikey sighed, his eyes drifting to the people outside the window. I feel like, sometimes, I'm just pretending everything's okay. Like, yeah, I'm helping people. But inside, I'm still fighting my own battles. I still wake up some mornings and feel like I've got this weight on my chest that I can't shake off. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing Mikey's words. He had noticed that his best friend hadn't been as carefree as he used to be. Mikey was still the same guy who cracked jokes and made everything feel lighter, but there was a heaviness to him now, something that wasn't there before. I get that, Jake finally said. I mean, we're helping all these people, but sometimes I think I'm just trying to keep my own head above water. It's like I'm helping others because it gives me something to focus on, but I haven't really dealt with my own stuff. Mikey turned to look at him. You've been feeling that way too? Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? We're supposed to be the ones with all the answers. But I think we're still figuring things out for ourselves. Mikey didn't say anything for a while, but when he did, It was with an air of seriousness that Jake hadn't seen in a while. Maybe we need to deal with our own stuff, you know? Like, maybe we can't keep running from it. We've come so far, but if we keep burying everything inside, it's just going to catch up with us eventually. Jake stared down at his coffee cup, feeling the truth in Mikey's words. It wasn't like he hadn't been avoiding certain things about himself, about the past. He had buried them deep down, focusing on the program, on helping others. But maybe Mikey was right. They couldn't just keep running. What do you think we should do? Jake asked, his voice quiet but steady. Mikey gave a small, thoughtful smile. I think we need to take a break from all the helping. We need to check in with ourselves. Like, really check in. Talk to someone, get some perspective. If we're going to keep helping people, we've got to be okay ourselves first. Jake nodded slowly, the idea settling in his mind. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew it was true. They couldn't keep pretending they had everything figured out when they were still carrying their own baggage. Maybe it was time to confront their pasts head-on, deal with what was still lurking under the surface. The next week, they decided to reach out for professional help. It was a big step, and for both of them, it felt like admitting weakness. But the more they talked about it, the more they realized that it wasn't weakness. It was strength. It took strength to ask for help, to face the things they had been avoiding. They found a therapist who specialized in addiction recovery and mental health, someone who could help them navigate their emotions and give them tools to handle everything they had been carrying. The first session was awkward. Both Jake and Mikey felt nervous, unsure of how to open up about things they hadn't spoken about in years. But as the therapist asked questions, they started to peel back the layers of their pasts, layers they had been hiding from for far too long. Jake found himself talking about the anger he had carried for years, the feeling of abandonment after his father left, the way he used smoking to fill the hole inside him. Mikey spoke about his fear of failure, how he had always felt like he wasn't good enough, how smoking had been a way to cope with the pressure to be perfect. By the end of the session, both of them felt emotionally drained, but also lighter. They had started the journey of healing, a journey they had put off for too long. Over the next few weeks, they continued their sessions. It wasn't easy. Sometimes it felt like they were digging up things that were better left forgotten. But the more they worked through their pain, the more they began to understand each other and themselves. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Jake and Mikey sat together in the park again, just like they had months ago. The air was cool, and the night sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above them. You know, Mikey said, breaking the silence, I never realized how much I was carrying around. It feels weird, like I've been walking around with a backpack full of rocks my whole life, and now I'm finally putting it down. Jake nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. Yeah, I get that. I think I've been doing the same thing. I've been so focused on helping others, I forgot to help myself. He exhaled slowly. But I think we're getting there. Little by little. Mikey leaned back, gazing up at the stars. I'm proud of us, man. I really am. It's been a long road, but we're doing it. We're not perfect, but we're not the same people we were. Jake smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Yeah, we've come a long way, and we're going to keep going. Together. Mikey grinned, giving Jake a playful shove. Damn right. No more running from our problems. We're facing them head-on from now on. Jake laughed, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. No more running. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars. And for the first time, neither of them felt the need to rush. Neither of them felt like they had to prove anything to anyone. They were exactly where they needed to be, on the path to healing, on the path to becoming the people they were always meant to be. And as they sat there, side by side, Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more ready than ever before. The next day, they got a message that would change everything once again. It was from the board of the mentorship program. They had been so impressed with the work Jake and Mikey had done in the past year that they wanted to expand the program. They were offering Jake and Mikey the chance to take the program to a national level, to bring it to other schools, to other communities. Jake stared at the message in disbelief. He turned to Mikey, his eyes wide. Mikey, this is huge. Mikey read the message over Jake's shoulder, then looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. We did it, man. We really did it. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt the rush of excitement that came with the knowledge that they were about to change even more lives. Their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The news about the national expansion of their mentorship program hit Jake and Mikey like a tidal wave. They had spent months building something that was already having an impact in their local community, but now they had the opportunity to take it further, to reach more people, to help more kids who were struggling just like they had. Jake sat on the couch that evening, his phone still clutched in his hand as he reread the message from the board. It was official. The program was expanding to several states, and they wanted Jake and Mikey to lead the charge. It wasn't just about teaching kids to quit smoking anymore. It was about a comprehensive approach to mental health, addiction recovery, and providing support for those who needed it the most. Mikey walked into the living room, his face lit up by the glow of his phone screen. "You seeing this?" he asked, holding up his phone. This is real, man." Jake looked at him, his eyes wide. "I know. I can't believe it." Mikey grinned, but there was a sense of nervous excitement in his eyes. "It's everything we ever wanted, right? We get to help more people, on a bigger scale." He sat down beside Jake, staring at the message again. "But it's also terrifying. This is going to be a lot of work. Are we ready for this?" Jake paused, letting the weight of Mikey's words settle. The responsibility was huge, and part of him still felt like they were just two kids who had barely pulled themselves out of the mess they'd made. But another part of him, one that had been growing steadily over the last year, felt ready. He turned to Mikey and smiled. "We've been ready. We've been doing this since day one. This is just the next step." Mikey looked at him, then slowly nodded. "You're right." He leaned back on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "But I think the hardest part is going to be trusting ourselves. I mean, we've made so many mistakes in the past. But now, we're supposed to be the ones leading this thing." Jake took a deep breath, the reality of it all starting to sink in. "We've earned this, Mikey. We didn't get here by accident. We've been through hell and back. And we're not the same people we were when we started. We know what it feels like to fall down and get back up. That's why we can help others." Mikey smiled, his shoulders relaxing. "Yeah, man. I like that. We've earned it." The following months were a whirlwind of preparation. They were busy setting up meetings, planning events, creating outreach programs, and finding mentors to join their cause. The program was expanding fast, and the support they received from both the board and the communities they reached out to was overwhelming. Jake and Mikey worked tirelessly, traveling to different cities to launch new mentorship groups, meeting with school administrators, hosting workshops, and doing interviews for local media outlets. Their success was undeniable. Everywhere they went, kids, parents, and teachers were praising them for the work they were doing. But even as the program grew, there were days when the weight of it all felt suffocating. There were moments when Mikey would look at Jake and say, "How did we get here?" And Jake would look back at him, both of them knowing that the path hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They were still finding their footing, still learning what it meant to lead. They were figuring out how to balance their personal lives with their newfound responsibilities, how to continue to help themselves while helping others. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but neither of them was ready to quit. Then came the moment that would truly test everything they had worked for. It was late one evening, and Jake had just finished a meeting with some potential new mentors. He was tired, his body aching from the constant travel and long hours. As he walked into his apartment, he found Mikey sitting on the couch, staring at his phone, looking unusually still. "Hey, what's up?" Jake asked, dropping his bag by the door. Mikey didn't immediately respond. His eyes were glued to the screen in front of him, and his face had an unreadable expression. Jake walked over to him, worried. Mikey blinked, as if snapping out of a trance, and handed Jake the phone without saying a word. The screen displayed a news article, the headline stark and alarming. "Former participant of local youth mentorship program arrested on drug charges." Jake's stomach dropped as he read the article, which detailed the arrest of a young man who had been a part of the program they had helped create. The article mentioned the young man's past struggles with addiction and how, despite the support he had received, he had relapsed. The details were painful. He had been caught with a large amount of drugs and was facing serious charges. Jake read the article again, his mind racing. This was the kind of story they had worked so hard to prevent. This was the nightmare that, even in their wildest dreams, they had never thought would happen. Mikey finally spoke, his voice low. This is what I was afraid of. What if we're not doing enough? What if we're just wasting our time, and none of this is actually making a difference?" Jake's heart sank. the fear in Mikey's voice making him realize how real this was. No, Mikey, we're not wasting our time. We're helping more people than we'll ever know. One mistake doesn't mean everything we've done is for nothing. Mikey shook his head, still staring at the article. But what if it does? What if he's just one of many who we can't save? I don't know if I can keep doing this, Jake. What if we're setting ourselves up for more failure? Jake placed a hand on Mikey's shoulder, his voice calm but firm. We can't save everyone. We can't fix everything. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. We have to keep moving forward. We have to help the ones who can be helped and show the others that it's never too late to turn things around. This isn't about perfection, Mikey. It's about progress. And progress takes time. Mikey looked up at him, his eyes filled with doubt. I don't know, man. I just don't know if we can keep doing this if people keep falling through the cracks. Jake took a deep breath, his own doubts creeping into his mind. But he shook them off. We're doing good. Even if we can't save everyone, we're still making a difference. We just have to trust the process. And trust ourselves. Mikey was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, you're right. We can't quit now. We have to keep going. For everyone else. Jake smiled, relieved. Exactly. We can't stop now. They sat together in silence, the weight of the situation heavy between them. But Jake knew one thing for sure. No matter how hard things got, they weren't going to give up. They had come too far, and the people they were helping needed them. They were stronger than they had been, and they were ready for whatever came next. And that night, as they stared at the screen together, Jake felt the fire inside him rekindle. They weren't done yet. They had a mission to complete, and it was bigger than any setback they could face. They would keep fighting. The weeks following that night were a turning point for Jake and Mikey. They had been faced with their first real challenge since starting the mentorship program, and it had shaken them. But instead of letting it tear them down, they used it as fuel to push forward. They doubled down on their efforts, fine-tuning their approach, and reaching out to even more kids who needed support. They worked harder to show everyone that a setback didn't mean defeat. It was just another step in the journey. They held more community meetings, organized workshops for families, and made sure to emphasize that recovery wasn't a straight line. They shared stories of triumph, but also of struggle, showing that it was okay to stumble as long as you got back up. They helped guide teenagers through tough days, reminding them that one mistake didn't define them, just like it didn't define the program or the mentors who were helping them. And slowly, they began to see the impact they had been hoping for. The kids they worked with started showing up for themselves, making the choice to fight for a better future. The mentors they had trained were becoming leaders in their own right, offering support and encouragement in ways that Jake and Mikey had once received. It was a ripple effect, and it was spreading far beyond what they could have ever imagined. Then, one day, they received an invitation to speak at a national conference on youth mentorship and addiction recovery. They were asked to share their story, how they went from being two troubled teens with nothing to losing to being the ones helping others find their way. As Jake and Mikey stood in front of the audience, surrounded by people who had been in the field for years, they shared their story, raw, honest, and real. They talked about their struggles, the pain, the mistakes. And they talked about how they had never stopped fighting. They spoke about the kids they had helped, the lives they had changed, and the power of second chances. When they finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the room erupted into applause, loud and genuine. Jake and Mikey looked at each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had come so far from where they had started. And in that moment, they realized that they had already succeeded in ways they never could have imagined. As they left the conference, Mikey nudged Jake. You ever think we'd be here, doing this? Jake smiled, looking out at the horizon. No, but I wouldn't change a thing. Mikey grinned, his voice filled with quiet pride. Me neither. We did it, man. We really did. And as they walked down the hallway, side by side, Jake knew that their journey was far from over. There were still lives to change, still battles to fight, but they were no longer just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had been where they once were, and for everyone who needed someone to believe in them. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake and Mikey knew one thing for sure. They were ready. Together, they had proven that change was possible. And with each new day, they would continue to make a difference. And that was the most important thing of all.